Continuing on with our lifespan nutrition, this video needs to focus on the infancy stage. What do the infants need in that first 24 months? And what are we looking at to help them be as strong as possible? Starting with infancy, it's considered from birth until 24 months of age. Now, even within this set of infancy, kind of break it down as the first 6 months and then 6 months to 18 and 24. So really the first 6 months is primarily based on nutrition of either breast milk or formula, or a combination of the two. Now, obviously, the choice of breast milk versus formula is a very personal choice to a lot of mothers, and one that a lot of them can struggle a bit trying to figure out which is best for their new baby. Interesting side note here. At birth, about 80% of at least US infants start as breast milk exclusively. But by the time you hit 6 months, that 80% falls down to only about 25% are breast milk exclusive at this point. So a lot of times people might start that way and just things in life kind of changes as you move on. But there are many different reasons why a mother will choose breast milk or choose formula or a mixture of the two. Obviously, personal is a huge aspect here, but sometimes it's more the physiological, where the breast milk just isn't coming in, or maybe there's not enough of it to meet all the nutritional demands. So there's a lot of reasons here, and it's a very personal choice, and a lot of times it's something just to have to kind of discuss and figure out on your own. But what actually is in breast milk, and for that matter, formula? Now, both those will provide an adequate nutritional intake for that new infant. They're made up pretty much of about 40 to 55% carbohydrates, 10 to 20% proteins, and 40 to 55% fat. Now, that's the average numbers and average ranges for breast milk. And the formula numbers kind of try to mimic that mostly because breast milk is what is given as nutritional from the mother to the baby, and therefore they're assuming that that meets nutritional intake amounts. So the formulas are trying to mimic what the breast milk would do. Now, the reason there's ranges, though, is because every mother produces her own breast milk in a little different way. Depends on what she's eating, what her diet is, and just overall how her genetics create that breast milk. But overall, breast milk is about 87.5% water. The other 12.5% are broken down those carbohydrates, proteins, and fats or lipids. So when breast milk first starts after birth, the first 2 to 5 days is actually referred to as colostrum. It's a little bit different composition than the normal breast milk will be eventually. Then after that colostrum finishes, there's about 2 weeks of transitional milk. It's kind of modifying what's in there until you move into the normal full breast milk that baby will have then for weeks, months, or however long after that. But what's actually being eaten, again for the mother, is what's impacting what those numbers are. Now, the infant that's taking in this breast milk, or the formula for that matter, they're going to have a very high metabolic demand. You're saying, well, high metabolic demand. As an adult, we ingest a lot more as far as calories. True. It's nothing compared to adults calorie to calorie. But if you look at the physical size of an infant, so the weight, compare the caloric needs of that weight to an adult's weight and make sure they're ratioed correctly, the infant has almost double the metabolic demands that an adult would. So it's very important to make sure that infant is constantly meeting those metabolic demands as it's growing and developing. Now, a lot of that growth and development is going to be in the head and torso of the infant. That's why in that first 6 months, the body might not be a typical proportion of what we think for an adult. The limbs are a little bit smaller, the torso and head are getting larger. That'll catch up a little bit later on, mostly the toddler years. But the reason being is right now, all those organs are growing. The synapses in the brain are firing off and trying to grow and expand. The brain's growing. Well, the reason this is occurring is because all the systems are getting ready to function fully as they move into a later life. But think about the brain, for example. The brain, the synapses, they're all growing and getting larger and larger. May have noticed those soft spots on the baby's head called fontanelles. The posterior fontanelle, the one in the back of the skull, typically closes off about 8 weeks after birth. By that point, there doesn't need to be as much expansion of the skull or constriction of the skull from birth. But the anterior fontanelle, the one up front, that one might not close off until 18 months after birth, giving a little extra leeway as the brain grows in case the bones aren't quite keeping up as quickly. So it has that little bit of a soft spot, a little bit of shifting and maneuvering there if necessary. But now, most of these nutritional demands can be met by breast milk alone in the first 6 months, except vitamin D and vitamin K are traditionally lower in breast milk. Just can't get enough into the infant. There are some states in the US that actually have a law saying every new infant that's born needs to have a shot of vitamin K. That's just to make sure they have adequate amounts, and then throughout those first checkups, they'll keep monitoring, watching what's being done, and make sure adequate amounts are there and present. So there really isn't one set guideline, though, of when to breastfeed until. If you look at the WHO, the World Health Organization, their recommendation is about 2 years old you should be weaning off of breastfeeding. But the American Academy of Pediatricians says about 1 year is the point. But honestly, even if breastfeeding occurs beyond those points, it's not necessarily harmful, but you gotta watch out for nutrient intake and how things go. Because around 6 months of age, you'll start introducing baby food into that diet. Now, the reason you're bringing this food in, it has to be make sure it's baby appropriate. So things like strained vegetables or those little baby meats that are pureed up. Avoiding heavy sugars on any of these. The reason you bring those in is to help with more micronutrients. The breast milk can still provide enough of the macronutrients, but the micronutrients start to become a problem, especially things like zinc and iron. Just there's not enough of it in the breast milk to meet the demands of that growing 6-month-old. So these new foods, beyond just starting to change into new foods, is also helping to supplement those micronutrients, making sure that infant is getting all the nutrients, macro and micronutrients, that are necessary. Now, as that changes, obviously you try different foods, see what the baby likes and doesn't like. But it's also helping get that new infant to develop different tastes for different foods that they'll eventually move into later in life. But all that breast milk that's being produced for that infant, it's all coming from the mother's energy reserves, from what she's eating, but also potentially from her fat reserves that she already has in her body. But as all those energy reserves are being utilized, that mother still needs to also increase her water consumption. Remember, breast milk was about 87.5% water. So it's not just making sure it's appropriate for the infant, but the mother is compensating on her side for the production of this that'll go to the infant. And her diet needs to make sure it's still appropriate for the infant, which means avoiding or limiting toxins, heavy metals, because all of those get passed into the breast milk that she's producing. That also goes for alcohol and tobacco. Some women, when they're breastfeeding, if they have a little bit of alcohol, may decide that they should pump and then remove or discard that breast milk. That way the alcohol is not being passed on to that infant. Again, personal choices though. So some benefits of breast milk. Now, it's not saying breast milk is necessarily better than formula because they both have benefits. But in the case of breast milk, it helps to reinforce the baby's immune system. Now, the way this works, and the reason this can be beneficial, is initially that new infant doesn't have much of an immune system. Sure, they have the mechanics in their body, but they haven't been exposed to the different pathogens, the different bacteria or viruses. And because they haven't had that exposure, they haven't had the chance to build up their immune system to be able to recognize those. So, in the case of why this is beneficial, if the mother is exposed to a pathogen, let's say a bacteria or virus, then that mother will make antibodies to fight that infection. They can make what are called class IgA antibodies. These IgA antibodies, though, can go into the breast milk. Then the infant drinks the breast milk and therefore ingests these IgA antibodies. The antibodies can coat the GI tract of the infant. Therefore, by coating the GI tract, any of that infection that happens to get into the GI tract, because we all know that infants keep their hands out of their mouths, no questions. Yeah, they're constantly touching, grabbing, putting things in their mouth. So any of that bacteria or virus that might get in there has an antibody to recognize it and help destroy it or mark it for destruction. There's a second thing that could potentially help, and this isn't proven either way yet, there's some papers on both sides here, is breast milk may help to lessen allergies in that infant. Again, they're not conclusive either way. They're saying it may, but they haven't been able to really prove it either way at this point. Another benefit, which this one can go either way, the idea of skin-to-skin contact. So during breastfeeding, there's skin-to-skin contact. That may help to regulate the hormones in both the mother and the infant. Now, sure, with formula, you can do the same thing. Just instead of having the skin-to-skin contact on the breast and the mouth, skin-to-skin contact could be on the torso and their torso. So you can still, some mothers will do that with a bottle, but still hold it skin-to-skin to have that contact there. So that one can go both ways. Now, as far as bottle feeding, you have similar nutrients from the breast milk because they're based on the same thing there. But one benefit here is by bottle feeding, it allows anyone to feed that infant. The mother can get more rest. Maybe someone else can help take over a feeding or two. But a downside here is the cost. Breast milk obviously is produced by the mother, while formula has to be purchased, and that can get very expensive very quickly. Some insurances may help with the cost of that. It's depending on how the insurance is, depending on income state, but either way, it is an added cost to that new infant. But once we hit that 6-month mark, we've already mentioned that 6 months, you'll start to need to supplement with some baby food. But as you go from 6 months until 12 months, you're changing the different foods, trying different foods. And this will change as the age increases and the number of teeth increase. But regardless, under the 12-month mark, you should avoid any honey for the infants. Reason being is honey can have the bacteria called Clostridium. That Clostridium could cause botulism in the new infant. Now, in adults, it doesn't impact us because we have a different system built in place. But for that young of infants, it could be problematic. So no honey under 12 months. Cow's milk should not be used under 12 months. Cow's milk has too many proteins and too many minerals that new infant just cannot digest and handle. It can cause all kinds of GI problems. You want to avoid any artificial sweeteners, or for that matter, overly sugary foods. Again, it's just not healthy for the infant and can be empty calories, not benefiting the growth of that new infant. Avoiding raw or partially cooked meats, especially important under 12 months still. Because again, raw or partially cooked meats can have bacteria present that can cause more problems for an infant than it would for an adult. Now, beyond 12 months, that 12 to 24 month range, you'll be trying more foods, experimenting with more contexts of foods. It won't all be the pureed stuff. So now it could have to have some texture to it as more teeth develop, and as it gets closer and closer to 2 months, closer and closer to 2 years, then the foods will keep changing. But regardless, the first 24 months, the goal is balanced nutrition. Balanced nutrition that is nutrient dense and not being empty calories, not being overly sugary or sweet things. They're trying to make sure you're supporting the growth of this new infant, to make sure they're growing all their systems as efficiently as possible. So infancy, 0 to 24 months, what's being given to them and how they're developing a little bit. Until the next video.